I begin this morning with an excerpt from a UU World article written by Kimberly French in the May 28, 2007 issue. Early New England graveyards were desolate, frightening places, the stuff of nightmares, devoid of trees or grass. They were more like town dumping grounds. Vandals and vagrants hid in them. Markers were engraved with death heads and skeletons. Graves were often left open to make room for more coffins. The living hesitated to walk past them, much less enter to pay their respects to the dead. With the liberalization of Puritan New England and the rise of Unitarian in the early 19th century came the need for a new kind of final resting place. In 1831, Bostonians, led by two Unitarians, physician Jacob Bigelow and U.S. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, founded the nonprofit Mount Auburn Cemetery on a 74-acre farm in Watertown, 4 miles outside the city, the nation's first rural or garden cemetery. It was the first to use the term cemetery, from the Greek kometerion, for place of sleep, rather than burial ground. The idea of garden cemeteries, where both the living and the dead could mingle with nature, quickly caught on. Within 15 years, 9 other cities had founded their own, and the movement spread throughout the country. Now, Lafayette had been founded 6 years earlier by William Digby, and he was buried in the Greenbush Cemetery, which was founded in 1848. In your order of service, I have made a little booklet of some of the cemeteries I have visited in my 8 years of Indiana living. And I begin at Greenbush. It's on the corner of 9th Street and Greenbush Avenue, and its gates proclaim, "Here rest our settlers." And William Digby has 2 stones, his original stone, which is barely legible because it's worn with age. He died in 1863. And then a second stone that I have pictured on the booklet, that is a plaque commemorating him as the person who laid out the first plat of our city. This garden cemetery is pleasant to stroll around, and it contains the graves of veterans of the Revolutionary War, and it has many interesting gravestones. It's somewhat of a sculpture park. There are tombstones that resemble tree stumps and logs, and there are angels and pillars with urns on them, and weeping willows carved into the face of the stones. And George Winter, an artist who painted watercolors of Native Americans in the early 19th century, has a painter's palette and brushes carved into his stone. And Albert Bruce, a Universalist pastor who died in 1871, has an open Bible resting atop his tomb. But the saddest sculpture I have seen in any cemetery anywhere And I grew up as a child playing in the cemetery about a block from my home. I've just always liked cemeteries. I don't know why. Perhaps I need therapy. And I seek it regularly. But the saddest tombstone I have ever seen, I have portrayed here, and it's a slaughtered sheep draped across an altar. It's not unusual in graveyards, especially when it's the death of a child, to have a lamb kind of perched in a resting position on top of a stone. But the lamb usually looks like it's resting in peace. But this grave, on the front, it's an adult. And it just is such a sad and tragic picture. It just does not sugarcoat death at all. There's no angel, there's no scripture, there's no beautiful tree portrayed. It's death. Another interesting thing in the Greenbush Cemetery is a special Civil War memorial, and you can see it from the corner of 9th and Greenbush, because there's a tall pillar and then a line of graves. And on the pillar that was erected only in 2011, it says, "Here lie the Confederate prisoners who died in Lafayette, Indiana, after surrendering at Fort Donelson, Tennessee in 1862. And the Union dead include those killed in a train wreck near Stockwell, Indiana in 1864. So the history behind that is that there was a prisoner of war camp up here, and that there was a flu outbreak, and a lot of prisoners died. And then there was a couple years later, there was a train of soldiers going off to fight in the war, and before they ever got to the war, there was a train wreck. And these soldiers were both buried side by side in the cemetery. And they're buried side by side. And something that I haven't seen before, because usually I have only said the only place that I've ever respected seeing a Confederate flag was in a memorial garden where the person was buried under the flag they fought for. I can understand that. But in the Lafayette Cemetery, when I took these pictures, there was American flags on all the graves, which, when I was thinking about it, is much more important, is the better way to do it. They surrendered, they lost the war, and they are once again Americans. They are not people of a foreign country. We welcome them back even in death as Americans. Now, this was a war that tried to divide us, and it divided us over one of our greatest divisions of race. But the stories of our cemeteries talk about another division, and that division of religion. Before the Civil War, there was a grand migration into this country of the Irish, and there was a big party that was called the Know Nothing Party, which was heavily anti-Catholic. and that Catholics had to have their own graveyard that was separate from Protestant graveyards. And we have that tradition here at St. Mary's Cemetery up on Old Romney Road. And similarly, in 1851, there was established a Jewish cemetery because Jews were not buried in the same place as Christians. And even up in Reynolds, Indiana, there's the Lutheran cemetery. I don't know whether they were segregated by choice or by design of the other residents of Reynolds, but their cemetery was segregated. There was that sense of being segregated in death, even as they are segregated on Sunday mornings or on Saturdays. But as divisive as war is, it also has a sadly unifying feature. I live on Soldiers Home Road in West Lafayette, and there's the Soldiers Home Cemetery. The Soldiers Home was established in 1893 as soldiers from the Civil War were aging and dying. And so it was a rest home for veterans and also a graveyard for those who had died and their widows. And when you're in a war, the bullet doesn't care about your ethnic background, about your religious background. The brutality of war is universal. And the anonymity of war, when you look at the graves from a distance, and it's tombstone after tombstone, the same shape, with slight variations over the years when they knew technology of how to carve into the stone changes, but the stones from the Iraqi war are the same as the stones from the Civil War. They're basically about this tall, white, this wide, little curve on the top. And so there's a sense of unity, which on one hand feels good in that all that divides us is erased by the camaraderie of soldiers. But it's also evil in that all individuality is wiped out by the cause of war. And such is the complexity we live with in all our lives. And you tour around the different parts of the cemetery and you see all the different conflicts our country has been involved with, from the Civil War to the Spanish-American War to World War I, the different theaters of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the recent wars in the Middle East. And the sheer number of graves is overwhelming. And you can't help but know that we have not been a peaceful people. And the last picture on the middle of this booklet shows a tiny chapel nestled in the woods. and two graves, a soldier from the Civil War and his widow, an individual, a woman whose name, ironically, is Indiana, a widow named Indiana. Her personal name stands for all of us who grieve the sadness of war. As I ramble around the county looking for beauty, often natural beauty, I often stumble across human beauty, the things that people make to remember their loved ones. And one of the most impressive cemetery gates is down in Dayton, Indiana, along Highway 38. There's a stone gate archway with a lot of little field stones in it. It's about the size, each about the size of your hand. So whoever built it was taking lots of little stones and piling them up to make this gate as an entryway to where their loved ones are. And the day that I took these pictures, there was a woman from Chicago there, and she was visiting the grave of Shannon Hoon, who was a rock and roll singer from a band called Blind Melon. And he died about 20 years ago at the age of 28 from a drug overdose. And there's been festivals celebrating him and his band here in town. I think every October. I've never happened to make one of those, but just something of a local celebrity, and it's just interesting that people from all around come and lay things at this person's grave, because he, in his life, as short and tragic as it was, created some beauty that touched people, and they come and make offerings at his grave. And then on another grave in that cemetery, to someone who is unknown to me, and it is a grave so old that maybe it's unknown to anybody in Dayton, because maybe the relatives have all moved away. There was a grave that had a dove placed on it. But the grave was so old that all the artistic features of the dove, all the details, any of the feathers or the beak or eyes, had just been worn away by the wind and the rain. So it was only a shadow of a dove, a softness. And I think that sometimes grief is like that. When it's new, it has that edge, and everything is so clear. And then it kind of softens, and we feel less pain. But also, sadly, our memories are like that too. We remember people, and sometimes we remember all these little details of their lives. But as the years go on, those memories get jumbled with other memories, And they kind of soften as a feeling and kind of get encased and kind of merge with just who we are. And we can't really remember what they actually were and what we projected upon them. They just are part of us. Just as part of this stone is dust in the atmosphere that is miles away, but still part of this world. One of the most beautiful cemeteries I've happened upon is in the town of Buck Creek. The town of Buck Creek. How many have visited the town of Buck Creek? Well, that's quite a few people. More people have visited Buck Creek than probably live in Buck Creek. And more people are probably in the cemetery than live in Buck Creek. You can now see it from the new highway that bypasses it, Highway 25 that runs up to Delphi. If you get off the highway, there's a slight rise, and underneath this spreading maple tree, there's these stones, and there's a wrought iron fence that separates the road and the creek. And it's a well cared for cemetery. Somebody around there still remembers who's buried there. It's still active and cared for by the few people who still live in that neighborhood. And along the back fence of the cemetery, right up against the creek, there's a tree that has grown up and has merged with the fence. This iron that separates the land of the living from the land of the dead. This tree has none of it. It says, I'm living on the border of life and death, and I embrace death, yet I live. And that tree is very important to me. Because as someone whose mother died when I was 15 and my father died when I was 27, I think earlier than most of my peers, I kind of realized death is going to get us all. And then I also realized that it's not the worst thing in the world. That there is a kind of beauty to it, and there is a kind of survivability to it, and there is a kind of understanding that life is precious. Especially when I was in college, when people in college tend to treat time like it's an infinite thing, and they could waste it as if there was no harm being done. To realize that it's precious, and the time you spend with people is valuable, and cherish it. And that's what that tree does, lives on that border of life and death. Because if you deny death, in some sense you are denying how precious each moment of life is. Because you're thinking that life is unlimited. But if you acknowledge death, you realize life is limited and how wonderful and how precious it is and how important today is. We build these cemeteries, we build our careers, we build our lives, our families, some of us write books or songs or papers, trying to build a legacy. And there are people who did wonderful things hundreds of years ago that are totally forgotten. And out on Highway 26, almost all the way to Rossville, there's Coons Cemetery. It was active between 1845 and 1908. I didn't put a picture of the sign that gave you that information because it's so faded, you can only really read where the paint used to be. And nobody takes care of this cemetery. The stones are broken. The prairie grass grows over it. It's surrounded by a cornfield. Tree falls. No one hears it. But the lilies, remember, they grow. No one brings flowers to these graves, yet flowers are there. They are part of what's eternal. These people who I don't know, who I can't read their stones, I can't read their names, have contributed to beauty. They may have ripples in their lives, touching people who don't even know that they've been touched by these people. And these flowers grow and remember them. We're approaching Memorial Day. I don't know what you do on Memorial Day, whether you have graves that you visit. When I think of what I'm going to do when I die, I plan to get cremated, and there's probably not going to be a grave. And I think cremation makes the most sense. It's not a waste of land, and it's most ecological. But at the same time, I miss the idea of leaving a place for people to be, because I enjoy the cemeteries of strangers, because I think they're beautiful places. So to be cremated uses less land, but it also loses history. But it does embrace our return to the elements. So I want you to think about how you can be like that tree, how you live embracing the border between life and death, and how the cemetery that you have visited lives and influences you. We'll sing hymn number 352, Find the Stillness, and then we'll talk.